The map tore down the middle, the exact moment Reuben Archer realized he had been lied to for 6 years. He stood in the center of Inez Merritt's small schoolroom, the two halves of the parchment dangling from his fists, and the rage that moved through him was not the hot, burning kind he was accustomed to in barroom brawls or border skirmishes. It was cold. It was the kind of cold that settles into a man's bones when he understands, with absolute clarity, that everything he has sacrificed and everything he has bled for has been built on a foundation of deliberate, premeditated betrayal. "You knew," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, which made it more dangerous than a shout. "You knew what was written in those margins and you said nothing." Inez did not flinch. She stood at the front of her classroom beside the slate board, her dark hair pinned at the nape of her neck, her brown eyes steady on his. She was holding a piece of chalk in her right hand with the calm precision of a woman who had learned long ago that flinching invites more cruelty. "I knew what the margin said 2 hours ago," she replied. "Not before. If you would stop tearing things apart long enough to listen, I could tell you what I found." "What you found?" He slammed both halves of the map onto the nearest desk so hard that the inkwells rattled. "That map has been in my coat for 6 years. I carried it across half of New Mexico territory and all of Texas, and 300 miles of nothing but alkali flats and Apache country. 6 years. And you are standing there telling me you decoded it in 2 hours. 2 hours and 14 minutes, Inez said, setting the chalk down with deliberate composure. "And yes, because whoever drew that map did not want a drifter to read it. They wanted someone who understood Spanish ecclesiastical notation, from the mission period, 18th century Castilian land grant abbreviations, and the surveying cipher used by the original Franciscan cartographers when they mapped water sources along El Camino Real." She paused, and something flickered behind her steady gaze that was not quite triumph and not quite apology. "I teach those subjects, Reuben. I teach them to 14-year-old children, and they understand them. The fact that you have been carrying a treasure map for 6 years without being able to read it is not a moral failing. It is simply a knowledge gap." He stared at her. She stared back. The afternoon sun pushed through the single glass window of the schoolroom and laid a band of gold across the wooden floor between them. And in that moment, in that suspended and trembling silence, something shifted inside Reuben Archer that he would spend the next 6 months trying to understand, and the rest of his life being grateful for. But they were not at that understanding yet. They were at the beginning of it, which is always the most dangerous part. Reuben Archer had ridden into the town of Soledad, New Mexico territory, on the second Thursday of October in the year 1878, and he had not intended to stop. He never intended to stop anywhere. Stopping was the first step toward belonging, and belonging was the first step toward loss. He had learned that lesson so thoroughly and so painfully that it had become the governing principle of his existence, as reliable and as cold as a compass needle. He was 31 years old. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his worn boots. His shoulders were broad in the way that comes not from vanity, but from years of hard labor, fence mending, cattle driving, breaking horses that did not want to be broken, digging irrigation channels in the hardpan of southern Colorado. His jaw was angular, shadowed with 3 days of dark stubble, and his gray eyes had the particular quality of alertness that develops in men who have spent too many years in country, where the difference between the living and the dead is often a matter of seconds. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip, not as a flourish but as a tool, the way a carpenter wears a hammer. The map had come to him 6 years earlier, in a saloon in El Paso del Norte, from a dying man named Curtis Vane. Reuben had not known Curtis well. 3 days of riding together across the desert, a shared canteen, the kind of temporary alliance that the frontier forges and the frontier dissolves without ceremony. Curtis had been shot by parties unknown, the lead already working its damage through his lung by the time Reuben found him behind the saloon, propped against the adobe wall with his hat tipped over his face and his breathing wet and labored. "Take this," Curtis had said, pressing the folded parchment into Reuben's hand with fingers that were losing their grip on the world. "Don't let Holloway get it. You hear me? Holloway cannot have it. There is something in the margins, something important, but I cannot," he had coughed then badly. "Find someone who can read the old Spanish, the mission kind. There is water on that map, Reuben. There is water, and there is something else, something worth more than water in this country." He had paused and his voice had dropped to a rasp. "There are people who deserve to have what is on that map. People who were robbed. Make sure they get it. Promise me." Reuben had promised because a dying man deserves a promise. He had folded the map into his coat pocket. And he had been carrying it ever since, showing it to every Spanish-speaking person he could find in 2 territories and 4 states, watching their faces go blank with confusion or their eyes narrow with the kind of interest that precedes robbery and learning nothing. The map showed terrain, a river, a canyon system, a series of elevation marks, but the margins were covered in tiny, cramped script that no one seemed able to fully decipher. Some said it was Old Castilian. Some said it was code. One man in Santa Fe who claimed to be a scholar had looked at it for 20 minutes and told Reuben it was liturgical Latin corrupted by a left-handed scribe, which had turned out to be wrong on all 3 counts. Reuben had, over the years, begun to think Curtis Vane had been delirious, and the map was nothing more than a feverish old man's last hallucination dressed up as a legacy. He had begun to think about throwing it away. The only reason he had not was the promise, which sat in his chest with the stubborn weight of a stone. He had ridden into Soledad because his horse, a brindle-colored gelding named Monday, had thrown a shoe 3 miles outside of town, and the nearest blacksmith was in Soledad, and that was the entirety of his reason for being there. He had not been looking for a schoolteacher. He had not been looking for anything except a hot meal and a reshod horse. He had found the blacksmith first. The blacksmith, a massive and good-natured man named Ephraim Torres, had taken one look at Monday's hoof and informed Reuben that he was looking at 45 minutes of work and that the saloon across the street served a reasonable beef stew. Reuben had thanked him, taken the advice, and was halfway through the stew when the door of the saloon opened and Inez Merritt walked in. She walked in the way a woman walks when she owns the floor she is standing on, which is to say with purpose and without apology. She was 27 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes and the kind of face that is not immediately, conventionally beautiful but becomes more so the longer you look at it. The way a piece of well-made furniture reveals its quality gradually, the joinery and the grain becoming more apparent as the eye adjusts. She wore a dove-gray dress that was practical rather than fashionable, a dark blue wool coat, and sensible ankle boots. She was carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder and a stack of paper-covered books under her other arm, and she moved between the tables with the focused efficiency of a woman who has a specific destination and a limited tolerance for obstacles. Her destination, it turned out, was the table nearest the window, which also happened to be the table at which Reuben Archer was sitting. "Excuse me," she said, setting her books on the far end of the table without asking permission, which Reuben found simultaneously irritating and impressive. "I need the light. The other tables are too dark." "Good afternoon to you too," Reuben said. She glanced at him. "Good afternoon." She opened one of the books and began to read, making it entirely clear that she considered the exchange concluded. Reuben had intended to finish his stew and leave. He had intended to maintain his governing principle of non-attachment and forward motion. He had, in fact, already begun the mental preparations for departure when the map slipped out of his coat pocket and slid across the tabletop and landed open in front of Inez Merritt's book. She looked at it. Then she looked at it more carefully. Then, without touching it, she leaned forward and something happened to her expression that Reuben had never seen in anyone he had shown the map to before. Her eyes sharpened the way a hawk's eyes sharpen when it sees something moving far below in the grass. It was not greed. It was not confusion. It was recognition. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "It was given to me," Reuben said, reaching to take it back. "6 years ago, by a man named Curtis Vane." Her hand moved faster than he expected, and she pressed her fingertips to the edge of the parchment, not preventing him from taking it but pausing him. "May I look at it?" "The margins, that notation in the margins, I have seen that system before." Reuben looked at her. "Who are you?" "Inez Merritt, I am the schoolteacher here." She met his gaze without wavering. "Who are you?" "Reuben Archer, I am passing through." "Well, Reuben Archer who is passing through," she said, with an edge in her voice that was not quite sarcasm and not quite warmth. "I believe I can read what is written in those margins. I would need a couple of hours and better light than this saloon offers, but I believe I can." She paused. "If you are interested." He should have said no. The governing principle of non-attachment dictated no. But the dying man's promise, the stone in his chest, said something else entirely. "I am interested," he said. That had been the morning. The 45 minutes Ephraim Torres had estimated for Monday's shoe had stretched to 3 hours because the gelding had, in the manner of horses everywhere, waited until his hoof was being worked on to develop what appeared to be a stone bruise in the same foot, which Ephraim examined with grim professional thoroughness and recommended a 2-day rest minimum. Reuben, who had no particular place to be by any particular time, had agreed. He had arranged for a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who had sharp eyes and a clean house and a rule about no smoking indoors, and he had given Inez Merritt the map. He had watched her face when he handed it to her, looking for the calculation he had learned to watch for, the flicker of hidden motive that precedes a betrayal. He had seen none. What he had seen instead was the look of a person encountering a puzzle they have been waiting their whole life to solve, and that look was so genuine and so unguarded that it had surprised him. He had spent the hours of Monday's rest walking the town of Soledad, which was small and sun-bleached and spoke of the particular resilience of frontier communities. It had a general store run by a man named Horatio Pike, who had an opinion on everything and shared it freely. It had a church with an adobe bell tower. It had the saloon, the boarding house, the blacksmith, a small doctor's office, and the schoolroom, which stood at the end of a short unpaved street and was built of pale adobe with a wooden door, painted the particular shade of blue that the Spanish-speaking settlers of New Mexico territory used to ward off spirits, though Reuben suspected Inez Merritt had chosen it for aesthetic rather than superstitious reasons. He had not been worried about the map, precisely. He had been thinking about her recognition of it. He had been thinking about the margin notation and the dead man and the promise, and he had been building in his head the careful, provisional architecture of trust that a man with his history builds when he encounters something that might be worth trusting. And then he had gone to the schoolroom to collect the map, and the door had been open, and he had walked in, and Inez had been standing at the front of the room with her eyes on the blackboard where she had copied some of the margin notation in large clear letters, and she had turned to him with an expression that he had not known how to read, and he had seen the map on the nearest desk, and he had picked it up and felt the rage come before he could stop it, and then the tearing, the two halves dangling, and the confrontation that had opened the story at its sharpest and most dangerous point. Now they were here, the two halves of the map on the desk, the gold band of afternoon sun on the floor between them, and Inez Merritt looking at him with those steady brown eyes that refused, absolutely refused, to be intimidated. "Sit down," she said, not a request, an instruction. He sat down. He did this mostly because he was surprised enough by the directness of it that his legs responded before his pride could object. She pulled the two halves of the map together and examined the tier with a professional calm that infuriated him and drew him at the same time. She set them side by side on the desk, weighted each piece with a book, and turned to the blackboard where she had written her translation. "The margins of this map," she began, are written in a notation system developed by Franciscan missionaries in New Spain during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It was used to record sensitive information, water rights, land boundaries, records of indigenous settlements, in a form that could be read by educated clergy, but not by soldiers or civilian administrators, because the relationship between the missions and the colonial military was frequently adversarial. She paused and looked at him. "Are you following me so far?" "Keep going," he said. "The notation in your margins is not a code in the way most people think of codes, meaning it is not substitution cipher. It is a system of abbreviation and contextual reference. To read it, you need to know the source text it abbreviates. The primary source in this case is a specific land grant document from 1748 that established the water rights and territorial boundaries of a small community called Pueblo de Gracia, along what is now the western branch of the Rio Salado." She indicated a section of the blackboard. "This right margin contains a description of a hidden water source, a spring, that is approximately 20 miles northeast of here, inside the canyon system shown on the map. According to the margin notation, this spring has never been officially registered with the territorial government, which means whoever owns the land around it can claim the water rights without historical documentation," Reuben said slowly. "Correct. In New Mexico Territory in 1878, water rights are everything. The spring would make that land extraordinarily valuable for ranching." Her voice was steady and informational, but he could see the contained energy beneath it, the way a river looks calm on the surface over a deep and powerful current. "But the left margin is what matters more. The left margin contains a record." She paused, and in the pause he felt the weight of something significant approaching. "A record of what?" he said. "Of a community, a people. Specifically, a community of Mestizo and Pueblo Indian families who settled the land around that spring under the 1748 land grant, whose ancestors had been living in that canyon system for at least 100 years before the grant formalized their claim. The margin notation records their names, the boundaries of their land, the terms of the grant, and a notation by the original Franciscan cartographer to the effect that this document was copied onto the map margin specifically, so that it could not be separated from the physical evidence of the land itself." She turned to face him fully. "Someone made this map as a form of legal protection, a portable deed." Reuben was very still. "The people, the community recorded in the margin, are they still there?" Inez sat down across from him. The anger that had been in the room a few minutes ago had not left exactly, but it had shifted, rearranged itself around this larger thing. "That is the question," she said. "I know of a settlement about 18 miles north of here in the Canyon country. People call it the Canyon Community or sometimes just the Canyon. I have 3 children from that community in my school. They walk 4 miles each way, 5 days a week. Their families have been there as long as anyone in Soledad can remember. But there has been pressure, legal pressure, I should say, and other kinds for the past 2 years from a land company trying to claim those canyon lands as open range." The name arrived in Reuben's mind before she said it, the way a shadow arrives before the thing casting it. "The land company," he said. "What is it called?" "The Holloway Land and Cattle Company," Inez said. The stone in Reuben's chest shifted. Curtis Vane's dying voice, "Don't let Holloway get it." He closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, Inez was watching him with that focused, patient attention she gave to things that mattered. "I know that name," he said. "I suspected you might," she replied. "When you said the map came from Curtis Vane, I recognized the name as well." Curtis Vane filed a complaint against the Holloway Company with the Territorial Land Office 18 months before he died. He claimed they had falsified documentation to displace families from the canyon. The complaint was dismissed. He disappeared from the official record after that, and then about a year later I heard he had died in El Paso. Reuben told her the rest of it. The saloon wall, the wet breathing, the pressed parchment, and the dying man's voice. He told it plainly without embellishment because it was not a story that needed embellishment. It had weighed enough as it was. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse went past the window at a slow walk. Somewhere in the town, a child was calling to another child in the clear, carrying voice that children have in open country. "You have been carrying a portable deed for 6 years," she said. "I have been carrying a piece of parchment I could not read," he said. "There is a difference." "Not in terms of what it does for those families," she replied. "If this document is authentic and based on what I can read, I believe it is. The notation is consistent and the historical references check out against what I know of the mission records. It could constitute legal evidence of prior land grant claim. In territorial court, that is significant. Holloway's lawyers will dispute it." "Of course they will. Which is why we need the original land grant document it references, if it still exists." She pulled a notebook from her satchel and opened it to a page of tight, precise handwriting. The margin notation references an archive location. It says the grant document was deposited in the care of the mission of San Felipe de Neri in Albuquerque. The mission was founded in 1706 and still stands. If the archive has been preserved, the document may still be there. "Albuquerque is 4 days' ride from here," Reuben said. 3.5 if you ride hard and the weather holds," she replied. "I know because I did that ride last year to access the mission's educational records for a grant application." She met his eyes. "I can be ready to leave the day after tomorrow. I have a substitute who can take my classes for a week." He was quiet. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has just recalibrated an entire set of assumptions about another person. "You are not asking me to take you," he said slowly. "You are telling me you are coming." "I found the information in the margins," she said. "I know what document we are looking for. I know where the archive is and how it is organized. I have a professional relationship with the mission archivist, Father Delgado." She closed the notebook. "You have a horse, a gun, and a promise to a dead man. Together we are considerably more effective than either of us separately. This is not a complicated calculation." Reuben Archer sat in the small schoolroom of Inez Merritt with the afternoon sun going amber through the window and looked at this woman who had decoded in 2 hours what he had not been able to decode in 6 years, and felt something happen in the region of his chest that was neither the cold rage of earlier nor the stone of an old promise, but something altogether different, something warmer and more alarming. "All right," he said. "Day after tomorrow." She nodded. She reached across the desk and carefully picked up the 2 halves of the map. "I can repair this with thin paste and a piece of good paper on the back. By tomorrow it will be stronger than it was before." She looked at the tear and then up at him. "Things that break in the right place sometimes mend stronger. I read that in a book once." A pause. "I read it in several books, actually, but it is still true." He almost smiled. He caught it the way he caught most things that surprised him before it fully formed. But she saw it. He was fairly sure she saw everything. The evening they spent at separate dinner tables, and the night they spent in their respective lodgings. And the next day, Reuben helped Ephraim Torres repair a section of fence behind the blacksmith's barn, because he was the kind of man who needed to be working when he was thinking, and what he was thinking about was Holloway. Gerald Holloway had a reputation that had preceded him across 3 territories like a bad smell precedes a stockyard. He was not precisely a criminal, in the way that precision is applied to these designations in a place where the law is a recent and somewhat theoretical institution. He was a man who used the available tools of legality, fraudulent documentation, compliant local officials, intimidating legal counsel to achieve outcomes that a different application of those same laws would have called theft. He had done this in Colorado. He had done it in Arizona territory. And according to what Inez had told Reuben that afternoon, he had been doing it here for 2 years, systematically pressuring the canyon community families with false land claims, cutting their fence lines, diverting water channels, and filing challenge after challenge in the Territorial Land Office in an effort to simply outlast them. The fact that Curtis Vane had been carrying evidence against Holloway and had ended up shot and dying behind a saloon in El Paso was not, to Reuben's mind, a coincidence. It had not been a coincidence for 6 years. He had simply not had the pieces to understand what it was instead. He said none of this to Ephraim Torres because he had learned to be careful about what he said, but Ephraim was a perceptive man and he said, while they worked, "You are riding out the day after tomorrow." "That is the plan," Reuben said. "Inez Merritt going with you?" Reuben looked at him. Ephraim shrugged, a gesture that encompassed considerable philosophically tolerance. "Small town. She asked me to check her horse's shoe this morning. Her horse, not yours." He handed Reuben the end of a fence post. "That woman knows what she is doing, whatever she is doing. I have known her 3 years. She does not make careless decisions." "She is a schoolteacher," Reuben said, and even as he said it, he recognized it as inadequate. "She is a schoolteacher who taught herself to read 6 languages, fixed the irrigation problem that the county surveyor said could not be fixed without $2,000 of equipment, and rode alone to Albuquerque and back when the Canyon community children needed books and the Soledad Town Council said there was no budget for them." Ephraim picked up his hammer. "Also, she is the one who figured out that the Hendricks mine accident last year was not an accident and got the safety commission down here, which is the reason 4 miners are alive today who would not be." He shrugged again. "But sure." "Schoolteacher." Reuben finished the fence post in silence and thought about what it means to underestimate a person, and why he had done it, and whether the instinct that had made him do it was self-protective or simply stupid. The morning of departure arrived cold and sharp, the kind of October morning in New Mexico territory that smells of piñon smoke and coming frost. Reuben was saddled and provisioned at first light. He had bought hard biscuits and dried beef and 2 full canteens from Mrs. Calloway, who had also pressed upon him a jar of her own preserved peaches on the grounds that a man did not know what he needed until he had it, which he suspected was her philosophy about more things than peaches. Inez arrived at the edge of town at the agreed time, which was early, on a compact and sensible roan mare named Clara who moved with the easy efficiency of a well-conditioned horse. Inez herself was dressed for travel in a way that indicated she had traveled before and understood exactly what it required. A split riding skirt, practical boots with good ankle support, a dark coat, and a hat with a wider brim than her everyday one. She had her leather satchel, a bedroll and saddlebags that, when Reuben assessed them with the practiced eye of a man who had packed for long rides his whole adult life, were packed with the right ratio of necessity to weight. She had also, he noted, the repaired map in a protective oilskin packet that she tucked into the inner breast pocket of her coat. She patted it once with a gesture that was less possessive than confirmatory, the gesture of a person checking that something important is where it should be. "Ready." She said. "Ready," he said. They rode north and then east toward Albuquerque, along trails that Inez knew better than Reuben expected. She rode well, which he also had not expected, though he recognized that his failure to expect things about her was becoming something of a pattern. She sat her horse with the balance of someone who has been riding since childhood, and she knew the country, which crossings were reliable, which arroyos ran deep in autumn, where the trails split, and which branch added unnecessary miles. The first day, they talked practically. She told him what she knew about the Holloway Company's legal strategy. He told her what he knew about Holloway's operations in Colorado, which was more than she knew. They compared information with the focused collaborative efficiency of 2 people who have independently been working on different parts of the same problem, and have recognized, suddenly, that their pieces fit. Around midday they stopped beside a creek to water the horses and eat, and Inez spread the repaired map on a flat boulder and pointed out what she had written in her notebook alongside it, the translation of the margin notation laid out in clear, organized sections. He had to sit close to follow what she was pointing to, and close meant he could smell the faint scent of ink and something else, something clean and warm. That was simply her. He moved back a precise 6 inches and looked at the map instead of her and focused on what she was saying, which was important and deserved his full attention. The margin notation also describes something else, she said, tapping a section he had not yet heard about. There is a reference to a secondary document, a testimony. Affidavit is perhaps a closer translation. It is described as the testimony of witnesses to the original land grant ceremony, signed and notarized. If this also exists in the mission archive, it would be even stronger legal evidence than the grant document itself. Who gave the testimony? Reuben asked. According to the notation, 7 witnesses. 3 of the names I recognize. She looked up from the map. They are the surnames of 3 of the families currently living in the canyon community. The weight of it settled over the afternoon. 7 witnesses who had watched a land grant established, whose testimony had been preserved in a mission archive for 130 years, waiting with the patience of preserved things for the moment when it might matter. Curtis Vane had known it was there. He had tried to use it and been prevented by violence or its threat. He had given the map to a drifter on a dying breath and hoped. Reuben thought about hope as they rode through the afternoon, the long slant of October light turning the mesquite, and the red rock the particular color of old gold. He thought about a man choosing who to trust with his last breath, choosing a stranger who had shared his water, and whether that trust had been well-placed or foolish, and what the difference was. He thought about what it cost a person to carry something for 6 years without knowing what it meant. He thought about Inez Merritt's hands on the map, her eyes going sharp, the 2 hours and 14 minutes it had taken her to unlock what 6 years had not. They made camp as the sun went down behind the western mesas, in a sheltered spot Inez had used before, with water nearby and enough scrub wood for a fire. Reuben built the fire. Inez made coffee from the supplies Mrs. Calloway had packed, which were better stocked than Reuben's own provisions by a meaningful margin, and set dried beans to soak for morning. They sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate and drank coffee, and the silence between them was not the tense silence of strangers or the guarded silence of people with hidden motives, but the quieter and more particular silence of 2 people who have spent the day being useful to each other and are now in a state of mutual cautious ease. "Can I ask you something?" Reuben said. "You can ask," she said. "Why Soledad? You speak 6 languages, you know the mission archives, you clearly know the law better than most lawyers I have met. You could be doing something else, somewhere else." She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that required honest engagement. "I was in Santa Fe," she said. "I had a position at the territorial school office, writing curriculum recommendations. Desk work. Important in its way, I suppose. But I kept thinking about the places that did not have curriculum because they barely had a teacher. The places where children walked 4 miles in the cold because education was something that happened somewhere else, not where they were." She paused. "I grew up in a place like that, Peñasco, north of here. There was one teacher for 60 children. She was remarkable, that teacher." She understood that what she was doing mattered more than any policy paper written in Santa Fe. She looked across the fire at him. "So I applied for the posting in Soledad. They were surprised to get an applicant, let alone one with my qualifications. I suspect they expected someone to last a year." "And you have been there 3 years," he said. 3 years and 4 months. A small, private smile crossed her face. "I will be there another 3 years and 4 months at minimum. I have things to do." "The Canyon community children," he said, "among others." She refilled his coffee cup without being asked, which was an intimacy so small and so natural that he registered it before he could prevent himself. "Those 3 children, Lucia, Benito, and Carmen Salazar, they are extraordinary. Lucia is 12 years old and she is doing mathematics that most adults cannot follow. Benito draws maps with a precision that a professional surveyor would envy. Carmen memorizes everything she reads, the whole page, word for word. She set the coffee pot down. "They are extraordinary, and the world is trying to take their home, and the world will not succeed. Not if I have anything to do with it." There it was. Not heroism as a performance, not goodness as a pose, but purpose as a structural fact. The way a foundation stone is not trying to be load-bearing, it simply is. Reuben looked at this woman across the fire in the high desert dark and felt the shift in his chest again, warmer and more alarming than before, and this time he did not catch it quickly enough to prevent it from being what it was. He was, with some speed and no preparation, falling in love with Inez Merritt. He managed not to show this. He had considerable practice at managing things he did not want shown. He asked her about the canyon community and she told him, and they talked until the fire burned low, and then they banked it and retreated to their respective bedrolls on opposite sides of the camp, and Reuben lay on his back looking at the tremendous depth of the New Mexico Territory sky and thought, no. And then, yes. And then, this is extremely inconvenient. The second day of riding brought them into rougher country, the land rising and folding into the shapes that precede the Rio Grande Valley, and it brought them also into the knowledge that they were being followed. Reuben noticed it first, because he had spent years developing the ability to notice things that were slightly wrong, and the rider moving along the ridge line to their east had been slightly wrong since mid-morning, too consistent, too well-paced, not crossing toward a destination but paralleling their route with the specific behavior of someone tracking rather than traveling. He said nothing for an hour, watching from the corner of his vision, checking angles, counting the dust. One rider, well-mounted. Keeping distance but maintaining it with professional discipline. "We have company," he said during a water stop, not turning his head toward the ridge. One rider. East Ridge, about 300 yards, been there since before the creek crossing. Inez poured water from the canteen with a steady hand and did not look east. "How long have you known?" "About an hour." "I noticed about 40 minutes ago," she said calmly, handing him the canteen. "I thought I might be wrong, so I waited for you to say something." He looked at her. She was adjusting Clara's girth strap with the practical focus of someone doing an ordinary task. "Ideas," she said. "Holloway keeps men on retainer," he said. "If word got out that the map was being translated, if someone in Soledad told the wrong person." Horatio Pike at the general store is known to relay useful information to land company representatives in exchange for favorable credit terms, Inez said, without heat or drama. "I should have thought of that before we left in a way that could be observed." A pause. "That was careless." "Not your carelessness," Reuben said. "Mine. I should have suggested a quiet departure. We both should have thought of it." She mounted Clara with a fluid, efficient movement. "What do you want to do?" "Keep riding." "Let him watch. He is one man, and one man at distance is gathering information, not planning action." He mounted Monday. "We will be in Albuquerque by tomorrow afternoon. Once we are in the mission with Father Delgado, we are in a different kind of position." "The mission has sanctuary status," she agreed. "Practically speaking, a Holloway man would not risk a public confrontation with a Catholic institution in a territory where the Catholic voter is numerically significant." A pause. "That is cold-blooded reasoning." "It is practical reasoning," he said. "In the circumstances." She almost smiled. "I like practical reasoning." She turned Clara north and they rode on. The rider on the ridge stayed with them through the afternoon, dropping back as the country changed, and the terrain favored different sight lines. By the time they made camp on the second night, it had been 2 hours since Reuben had spotted any sign of it, which meant either the rider had given up or the rider was good enough to be invisible, and he was not sure which of those was worse. The second night's camp was in a shallow canyon with a good wall behind them and clear sight lines in 3 directions. Reuben set the fire lower than the first night's and positioned himself where he could see the north approach without looking like he was watching it. Inez sat with her notebook open after dinner, writing, her handwriting rapid and small in the firelight. He watched her without meaning to. She bit her lower lip slightly when she was concentrating. She tapped the pen cap against the notebook edge when she was working through a problem. She was entirely unself-conscious about being watched, which told him either she had not noticed or she had noticed and found it unremarkable, and he was not certain which of those possibilities was more humbling. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything I have translated from the margin notation, in as much detail as I can. The original is the map itself, but if anything happens to it, I want the record to exist independently." She looked up. "Also, I am drafting a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, outlining the legal basis for the Canyon community's claim under the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which guaranteed that existing Mexican and Spanish land grants would be honored by the United States government. The Holloway Company's challenge is based on a claim that no valid prior title exists. Once we have the mission archive documents, that claim is demonstrably false." "You know the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo," he said. "Article 8 and Article 9 are particularly relevant to land rights," she said, and returned to writing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a question I probably should not ask." She kept writing. "Ask it. Is there anyone who would be bothered by you riding to Albuquerque with a man they do not know, a husband?" Or she stopped writing. She set the pen down with a deliberateness that made him feel the weight of it. "No," she said. "There was once. He decided that a woman who would rather be teaching in Soledad than keeping house in Santa Fe was not the kind of woman he had expected to marry." She said this without bitterness, which made it clearer and more honest. "He was probably right that I was not what he expected. He was wrong about the reasons." She picked up the pen. "Is there someone who would be bothered for you?" "No," he said. "I did not think so," she said, and resumed writing. He let that hang in the air and did not reach for it. He sat watch for the first half of the night. She took the second half without being asked, which he had not expected and should have. He slept 3 hours and woke to find her sitting where he had been, her back straight, her eyes on the dark country, with the kind of focused calm that is not unconsciousness but its opposite. Albuquerque arrived in the golden late afternoon of the third day, like a reward the land had been saving. It was the largest community either of them had approached in 3 days, full of the sound and smell of a working frontier city, horses, wood smoke, people, the particular commercial energy of a place that sits at a river crossing and knows its own value. The Rio Grande ran copper in the late light. The church towers of San Felipe de Neri were visible above the old town buildings, their adobe pale against the blue sky. Inez led them through the old town streets to the mission with the assured navigation of someone who had been there before, and Reuben was content, for once, to follow someone else's lead without reservation. There was something unfamiliar about that contentment that he chose not to examine too closely while they were riding. Father Delgado was a small, precise man of perhaps 60, with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers, and the hospitality of a man who understands that a library is only useful if people are welcomed into it. He recognized Inez immediately and with evident pleasure, and gave Reuben a measured look that was neither unfriendly nor unobservant. "Señorita Merritt," he said, and then in Spanish, which Reuben followed imperfectly but tracked, "you look as if you have been riding hard. Come in, come in. The archive is always open to you." The mission archive was a cool, high-ceilinged room behind the sacristy, smelling of old paper and beeswax candles. Father Delgado lit 3 lamps and Inez sat at the long table and opened her notebook and began to describe what she was looking for with the efficient clarity of a trained researcher. The priest listened, asked 2 sharp and specific questions, and disappeared into the shelved rows of the archive. Reuben stood near the table and felt the quality of this place, which was the quality of accumulated patience, of documents that had been waiting for the right hands to need them. Father Delgado returned in 22 minutes with a wooden document box, a flat wooden holder containing a large piece of vellum, and an expression of quiet excitement that he was working to contain. He set these on the table and stepped back. Inez put on the thin cotton gloves the priest had also brought and opened the document box first. She read for 4 minutes in complete silence. The quality of her stillness during those 4 minutes was the stillness of someone absorbing something enormous. Then she looked up at Reuben. "The land grant," she said, "dated 1748. Issued under the authority of the governor of New Mexico province, witnessed by the mission of San Felipe de Neri, confirming the territorial rights of the community of Pueblo de Gracia to the canyon lands and water rights of the western Rio Salado watershed." She turned the document so he could see it without touching it. The family names listed as original grantees: Salazar, Montoya, Reyes, Archuleta. She placed her fingertip near but not on the page. "These are the names of people who are currently living in the canyon. Their families have been on that land for 130 years. Reuben looked at the document, at the formal Spanish script and the official seals, at the evidence of a legal claim that had existed all along, waiting, like the map in his coat pocket, for someone to read it. "And the testimony," he said. She opened the flat wooden holder. The second document was there, the notarized affidavit of 7 witnesses, exactly as the map's margin notation had promised. Their names, their marks, the notary's seal. Father Delgado said, very quietly, "I did not know these existed. I inherited this archive 6 years ago. I have been cataloging it, but I had not reached the pre-1750 colonial land grants." He looked at Inez with an expression of immense gravity. "Who is trying to take this land?" "A company called Holloway," Inez said. The priest's expression shifted in a way that told Reuben the name was not unknown to him. "There was a man here," Father Delgado said carefully, "approximately 18 months ago, who said he was from a historical research organization. He was asking about the colonial land records. I told him our catalog was incomplete and we could not offer access without prior arrangement." His voice was flat and deliberate. "I did not like the way he asked. We need to have copies made," Inez said. "Certified copies with the mission's attestation." "I can have them ready by tomorrow morning," Father Delgado said. "With the mission seal and my signature as archivist. That will give them legal weight in a territorial court." They stayed at a small inn near the old town plaza, separate rooms, and that night Reuben walked along the river in the dark and thought about Curtis Vane and promises, and how a thing that seems like a burden can turn out to be the most important thing you ever carried. He thought about the families in the canyon, the Salazars and Montoyas and Reyeses, who had been getting up every morning for 2 years under the shadow of dispossession, whose children walked 4 miles in the cold because their teacher believed they deserved more than what the world was willing to give them. He thought about Inez Merritt, who had decoded what he could not, who was 3 doors down the hall sleeping the sleep of a person who has used the day fully, who had looked at a piece of parchment with ink-covered margins and seen, with the clarity of hard-earned knowledge, exactly what it was. He went back to the inn and slept without dreaming for the first time in several years. The next morning, Father Delgado had the certified copies ready at 6 in the morning, which told Reuben that the priest had stayed up most of the night completing them. He had made 3 sets, one for Inez, one to be sent by post to the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe, one to remain in the mission archive. They thanked him. He pressed both of their hands and said, in a mixture of Spanish and English, that he would pray for the families of the canyon and that some battles were worth every cost they demanded. Inez, her satchel now carrying documents that might change the lives of several families, walked out into the morning with the expression of a person who has done what they came to do and is already thinking about what comes next. Reuben walked beside her through the old town street, and the morning light lay on the adobe walls in that clean, particular way it has in high desert country after a cold night. "You were right," he said. She looked at him. "About what specifically?" "About the map, about the margins, about all of it." He stopped walking and she stopped a step ahead of him and turned, and he was looking at her with the full, unguarded force of his gray eyes. "I have been carrying that map for 6 years and treating it like a burden I could not put down. You sat down with it for 2 hours and you understood what it was, what it had been trying to be the whole time. He paused. I am not a man who says thank you easily. I had noticed that, she said. I am saying it now. He held her gaze. Thank you. Something moved through her face that was quieter and more honest than a smile. You made a promise to a dying man, she said. And you kept it for 6 years even when you did not know what you were keeping. That is not nothing, Reuben. That is, in fact, most of what mattered. They stood in the morning street in Albuquerque while the city woke around them, and the space between them, which had been the space of two strangers at a saloon table and had slowly, over 3 days and 2 nights of fire and stars and hard riding and harder thinking, become something else, felt suddenly very small. He stepped across it. He was not a man who approached things obliquely. It was one of the few things he knew clearly about himself. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face where the morning wind had loosened it from its pin, and his hand stilled against her cheek, and she turned her face slightly into his palm, not a dramatic gesture, a small and entirely honest one, and they were both completely still for a moment. Then she said, "We should get back to Soledad." "Yes," he said. His hand dropped. They resumed walking. But the world was different now, which is always how it works, not with declarations but with a single honest moment that everything else arranges itself around. The ride back was faster and more purposeful than the ride out. They took the most direct route, pushed the horses harder in the good weather windows of the day, and made camp briefly and efficiently at night. The rider who had shadowed them east did not reappear, which could have been reassuring but which Reuben found, instead, worrying. A man who has given up following you has either decided you are not worth following, or he has decided he already knows where you are going and will meet you there instead. On the last evening before Soledad, he told Inez this. She considered it. "If Holloway knows we went to the mission archive," she said, "and he sent a man who reported back rather than interfering, the most logical next action is to try to preempt the legal use of the documents, ideally before we can present them to the Territorial Land Office." She paused. The pending court date for the Holloway Company's challenge to the Canyon community's land is in 11 days. It is scheduled in the district court in Las Cruces. "Can we get the documents to a Las Cruces lawyer in 11 days? Reuben asked. "We can be in Las Cruces ourselves in 6 days, she said, "with the originals and the certified copies, and I can argue the legal basis for the claim." She said this without bravado, as simply as she said anything else. He looked at her. "You can argue it in court. I read law for 2 years before I chose education," she said. "I am not a licensed attorney, but the claim is clear enough on its face that a territorial judge who has any professional integrity at all should rule in the Canyon community's favor based on the documentary evidence alone. If I can present it coherently, which I can." A pause. "The more important question is whether the families know what is about to happen. They deserve to know." They rode into Soledad the following afternoon and went directly to the Canyon community. It was an 18-mile ride on a good trail that climbed into the red rock country Reuben had been able to see from town. And the canyon itself was what the map had described, and more a deep, protected fold in the earth with water and cottonwoods, and the remains of old agricultural terracing and small adobe houses that had been built and added to over generations, each addition different from the last in the way that family histories accumulate, one piece at a time. The Salazar family was the first they found. A man named Gabriel Salazar, broad-shouldered and deliberate, his wife Elena, and their 3 children, including Lucia and Benito, who looked at Inez with the devoted ferocity that students reserve for teachers who have actually changed their lives. The Montoyas came to the Salazar house within the hour, and the Reyeses, and 2 more families Reuben had not known about, and they sat in the courtyard in the late afternoon with the canyon walls rising around them, and Inez spread the map and the certified copies on the table and explained in clear and careful Spanish exactly what they contained. There was silence. Then Elena Salazar began to cry, not from grief, but from the particular overwhelming release that comes when a fear that has lived with you for so long it has become part of your structure is suddenly, unexpectedly removed. Gabriel Salazar reached out and put his hand over Inez's hand on the table, a gesture so simple and so full of meaning that Reuben felt something tighten in his throat. He looked around at the canyon walls, the terraced fields, the houses built in the shape of 130 years of a family's life, and he thought about Curtis Vane and the stone in his chest, and he felt it shift and finally, quietly, release. Gabriel Salazar looked at Reuben and said in careful English, "You kept this for us, for all those years." "I made a promise," Reuben said. "A good promise," Gabriel said. "A true promise." He extended his hand and Reuben shook it, and in the particular gravity of that handshake, which is a frontier form of an old and important ceremony, Reuben Archer understood that he had done what he had been carrying for 6 years, and it was enough, it was more than enough, it was exactly enough. The planning of the Las Cruces trip was practical and focused. Gabriel Salazar and an elder named Agustino Montoya would ride with Reuben and Inez to present the community's claim directly. The certified copies from the mission would serve as their legal documentation. Inez would prepare the formal presentation of the case, drawing on both the documentary evidence and the treaty precedents she had outlined in her notebook. There was also, they all understood without saying it explicitly, the question of what Holloway would do when he learned what was coming. "He will try to intercept," Reuben said, later that evening, when he and Inez were riding back towards Soledad in the dusk. "He will try something," she agreed. "I am not going to let that happen," he said. She looked at him sideways in the fading light. "Neither am I," she said. He had meant it as a reassurance. The way she said it back was not reassurance, it was collaboration. He was learning, slowly and with considerable pleasure, to understand the difference. They left for Las Cruces 3 days later, a party of 5. Reuben and Inez, Gabriel Salazar and Agustino Montoya, and a young man named Marco Reyes who was 19 years old, rode like the wind, and was apparently incapable of being left behind once he had decided to be somewhere. The court date was in 8 days, which gave them time if they rode steadily and nothing went wrong. Things went wrong on the 4th day, but not in the way Reuben had been expecting. They had made good time south, the weather holding dry and cool, and they were pushing through a stretch of open country between canyon walls when 2 riders appeared on the trail ahead, blocking it with the deliberate, relaxed positioning of people who have chosen their ground. Behind them, Reuben's practiced awareness counted a 3rd rider on the ridge to the west. 3 against 5, but he did not know how well Gabriel and Agustino and young Marco were armed, and he did not know the terrain behind them. The 2 riders ahead were wearing no particular identification, but one of them had the professional blankness of a man paid to be present and capable of things, and the other had the look of someone who had chosen to be there because it suited him. "Reuben Archer," the second one said, "not a question." "That is my name," Reuben said. "Mr. Holloway would like to buy those documents from you. He is prepared to be generous." Reuben felt the group around him go absolutely still. He did not look at Inez. He kept his eyes on the 2 men ahead. "Those documents belong to the people of the canyon community," he said. "They are not for sale. Mr. Holloway thought you might say that. He asked me to tell you that persistence in this matter would be bad for your health." "Mr. Holloway can tell me himself," Reuben said. "These documents are certified copies from the Mission Archive of San Felipe de Neri. One set is already in the mail to the Territorial Governor's office in Santa Fe. Another set is in Albuquerque with Father Delgado. The set we are carrying is the 3rd. He watched their expressions process this. "Buying, burning, or stealing the set we have with us would not change what already exists at the mission or what is already moving through the postal system toward the governor." He had told Inez to mail the 2nd set before they left Soledad. She had done it without comment, with the efficient forward thinking of a person who understands what contingency planning is. It was that action, that small and quiet preparation, that removed the leverage from the men in the road in a way that a gun alone could not have done. The two riders looked at each other. "Good day, gentlemen," Inez said from beside Reuben, in a voice of complete and rather magnificent composure. She nudged Clara forward at a steady walk, and Reuben moved Monday alongside her, and behind them Gabriel and Augustino and young Marco Reyes followed, and the riders on the trail held their ground but did not move to stop them because there was nothing now that stopping them would accomplish. The third rider on the ridge watched them pass and then disappeared over the crest in the direction from which they had all come. That evening in camp, young Marco Reyes said to Reuben in a tone of considerable respect, "You had already sent the copies." "Miss Merritt had already sent the copies," Reuben said. Marco looked at Inez. Then he looked at Reuben. Then he looked back at Inez with the expression of a young man encountering a category of person he had not previously fully accounted for. "You are very clever," he said to her in Spanish. "Thank you, Marco," she said, pouring coffee. Las Cruces was a substantial town in the Rio Grande Valley, larger and more formally organized than Soledad, with a proper courthouse and a district court judge named the Honorable Samuel Whitmore, who had a reputation for procedural rigor and, more importantly, professional integrity. They arrived 2 days before the court date and spent the first day finding lodging and a lawyer who would agree to formally file the Canyon community's claim and present Inez as an expert witness on the documentary evidence. The lawyer, a thin, careful man named Adalberto Fuentes, spent 4 hours with Inez going over the documents and the legal argument, and at the end of those 4 hours, he had the expression of a man who has been handed something more than he expected. "This is solid," he said. "The mission certification is impeccable. The treaty argument is well-founded. The chain of custody on the map itself is irregular, but the certified copies stand independently." He looked at Inez over his glasses. "You have done my job for me, Miss Merritt." "I left the filing for you," she said. Holloway's lawyers appeared in court the morning of the hearing, 2 of them, well-dressed, from a Santa Fe firm. They had the polished professional confidence of men who were accustomed to being the most legally sophisticated people in the room. They watched Inez take her place as expert witness, with expressions that moved from dismissive to uncertain, to something approaching alarm over the course of about 40 minutes. She was extraordinary. Reuben sat in the gallery with Gabriel Salazar and Marco Reyes and Augustino Montoya, and watched her present the documentary evidence to Judge Whitmore with the precise, organized clarity of a person who understands exactly what she is talking about and exactly why it matters. She was not showing off. She was not performing. She was simply, with complete competence and an absolute absence of hesitation, laying out a legal argument that was airtight because the foundation of it was historical truth and primary documentation. Judge Whitmore asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 with the specificity of a scholar and the accessibility of a teacher, which is a combination of rare value in a courtroom. When it came time for Holloway's lawyers to respond, the senior one attempted to challenge the authenticity of the mission documents. Inez, given the right to respond by the judge, produced Father Delgado's detailed letter of attestation, which she had solicited before leaving Albuquerque, and which addressed the authenticity challenge with such thorough preemptive clarity that Holloway's lawyer fell silent mid-sentence. Judge Samuel Whitmore was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said that the documentary evidence presented by the claimants was compelling, historically authenticated, and legally consistent with the provisions of the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. He ruled that the Holloway Land and Cattle Company's challenge to the Canyon community's land title was without legal merit. He certified the Canyon community's claim and instructed the Territorial Land Office to register it accordingly. It was, when it was done, very quiet in the courtroom. The kind of quiet that follows something real. Gabriel Salazar, who had been sitting absolutely still beside Reuben for the entire proceeding, let out a long, slow breath. Then he put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook once, hard, and Reuben put his hand on the older man's shoulder and held it there. Agostino Montoya looked at Reuben and nodded, a small and serious nod that carried the weight of something not easily put into words, which was fine because some things do not need words to be fully understood. Marco Reyes was grinning with his whole face. Inez came out of the witness area and walked to where they were sitting, and Gabriel Salazar stood and took both her hands in his and said in Spanish what he had said to Reuben in the canyon in different words but with the same meaning. You kept faith with us. You kept faith. She held his hands back and said that it was right that it had worked out this way, and that his children were extraordinary, and that she intended to make sure they stayed extraordinary, which she clearly meant as a promise of her own, a promise smaller in its scope than 6 years across the desert but no less sincerely made. Reuben stood a little back from this and watched her, this woman who spoke 6 languages and read margins no one else could read and argued a land case before a territorial judge and genuinely, fiercely cared about the children of the people standing in front of her, and he thought, I am not going to ride away from this. For the first time in 6 years, maybe more, the governing principle of forward motion felt not like wisdom, but like a habit that had outlasted its usefulness. They stayed in Las Cruces one more night to sign the final documents and make arrangements for the official land title certificate to be sent to the canyon community. On that last evening, after Gabriel and Agostino and Marco had gone to their lodging celebrating with a warmth and energy that the situation more than warranted, Reuben and Inez walked along the river road in the dark in the way they had in Albuquerque, but differently, because everything was different now that the thing they had set out to do was done. What will you do now? She asked. It was not quite a casual question. I have been thinking about that, he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the river in the dark. Soledad has a boarding house and a blacksmith and a general store and a school. It does, she said. What it does not have, he said, is a man who can fix fence lines and break horses and dig irrigation channels, and is willing to work in exchange for the kind of life that amounts to something more than riding from one place to the next. The silence that followed this was a specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when a person is deciding whether to allow a thing they have been wanting to allow. Mrs. Calloway mentioned that the old Vega property north of town needs someone to work it, Inez said. The land is good, water access is reliable, the house needs work but the structure is sound. She paused. She told me this several days ago before we left. I did not know why I was filing that information away. Now I do. He stopped walking and she stopped a step ahead of him and turned, the way she had in Albuquerque, and he looked at her in the river dark and she looked back at him and they were very close. I am not easy, he said. I have a dark past and bad habits and I do not say the right things naturally. I am not easy either, she said. I am opinionated and I work long hours and I read at the dinner table when I should be talking. I know, he said. I know that you know, she said. He kissed her then because there was nothing else to be done about it and no reason to postpone it. She kissed him back in the forthright way she did everything, honestly and completely present, and the river went past in the dark, and the stars above the Rio Grande Valley were enormous and the world, for the first time in several years for both of them, felt like something other than a problem to be crossed. They rode back to Soledad with Gabriel Salazar and Marco Reyes and Agostino Montoya, and the ride was different from any of the other rides because it had the quality of a journey toward something rather than away from something, and that difference is everything. Soledad received them with the quiet, observant attention of a small town that knows when something significant has happened and chooses to register it through small actions rather than celebration. Mrs. Calloway had hot coffee ready when Reuben arrived at the boarding house and pressed the jar of preserved peaches on him again, this time without commentary, which was itself a form of commentary. Efrain Torres came out of his forge to shake Reuben's hand and nod at Inez with the approving gravity of a man who had known both things were possible and had been waiting for the principals to catch up. Horatio Pike at the general store, who had, Reuben was fairly certain, relayed information to Holloway's people, was conspicuously quiet and businesslike in a way that suggested he was recalibrating, which was acceptable as recalibrations go. He ordered more books for the school without being asked. A few months later, it was his version of amends. The Vega property was exactly as Mrs. Calloway had described it. The land was good, the water access was reliable, and the house needed work, which Reuben began the same week they returned, not because there was any rush but because he was the kind of man who needed to be doing something, and what he was doing now had a different quality than anything he had done in years. It had direction. It had a fixed point it was oriented toward, which was the woman who walked up the road from the school every evening and sat on the half-repaired porch and told him about her day while he washed the work off his hands and listened, which was the best part of every day he had ever had. He asked her to marry him in December, which was 4 months after they had ridden together to Albuquerque, on a cold, clear evening when the first snow had dusted the high ground to the north, and the canyon country was white against the dark sky. He asked her without preamble or elaborate setting, because she was a woman who valued honesty over performance, and he said that he loved her, and that the specific nature of what he loved was not a single thing she was but the whole fact of her, the intelligence and the courage and the care and the way she taught him, constantly and without condescension, to see things more clearly. She said yes. She said it the way she said everything important, directly, without hesitation, as if the decision had been made some time ago and she had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment to formalize it. They were married in March of 1879 in the church in Soledad, with the pale adobe walls warm in the spring light and the blue-painted door of the school visible down the street, with Gabriel and Elena Salazar and Augustino Montoya and Lucia and Benito and Carmen watching from the pews, and Efrain Torres standing next to Reuben at the front of the church with the reliable solidity of a man who has decided to be someone's family, even when no formal designation exists for it, and Mrs. Calloway in the front row with the jar of preserved peaches on the pew beside her, which no one questioned because she was Mrs. Calloway, and she had earned the right to express herself through preserved fruit. The priest who performed the ceremony was not Father Delgado, who was in Albuquerque, but he had sent a letter that was read aloud, which said that he had prayed for them, and that the documents they had retrieved from the mission archive had now been fully incorporated into the official canon record, and that the Canyon community's title was secure and permanent and recorded in multiple jurisdictions, and could not now be legally challenged by any entity in the territory. He said this in the context of a blessing, which was a slightly unusual combination of legal and liturgical, but which was perfectly suited to the people involved. The reception was at the Salazar house in the canyon, because Elena had insisted, and because it was exactly right, the canyon walls surrounding everyone in that deep and ancient way, the cottonwoods beginning to leaf in the early spring, the spring water that the map's margin had described for 130 years running clear in the channel below the terraces. Lucia Salazar played the violin with the precision that Inez had told Reuben about, and she was extraordinary, and hearing her was another of those moments where the world briefly shows you the full extent of what it is capable of being. In the summer of that year, Reuben finished the house on the Vega property, which was now the Archer property by deed and by choice. He and Inez planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing corner, and a row of cottonwood saplings along the east fence that he expected to outlive both of them, which was a pleasant thing to expect. In the autumn, Inez discovered she was expecting their first child, and she told Reuben sitting on the porch with the same directness she brought to everything important, and he sat beside her and took her hand with a gentleness that was entirely uncharacteristic of his hands, which were large and work-rough and accustomed to hard things, and he held it carefully. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy and loud-voiced boy they named Samuel for Judge Whitmore, whose professional integrity had mattered, and whose middle name was Curtis, for a promise kept and a stone that had finally come to rest. 2 years later, a daughter came, Rosa, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness in equal measure, which meant she was going to be something rather extraordinary, which seemed about right. Lucia Salazar grew up to study mathematics at a university in Albuquerque, the first person from the Canyon community to do so, and she credited Inez Merritt, who was by then Inez Archer, entirely and publicly. Benito became a surveyor, precise and respected, and when he mapped the canyon lands officially for the territorial record, he used a notation system he had learned from his teacher that was clear and detailed, and nothing like the cramped, ambiguous margins of the old Franciscan cartographers, because he had been taught that clarity serves justice. The map itself, repaired with thin paste and backing paper by Inez on the evening they first understood what it was, hung in a small frame in the Archer kitchen. Reuben had intended, after the legal proceedings were complete, to give it to the Salazar family, to whom it properly belonged. Gabriel had refused, firmly and with warmth. He had said that the map had found its way to the right hands, and that it should stay with those hands, that some objects accumulate the meaning of what they have done, and should remain where that meaning is visible. So it stayed on the kitchen wall, the crease of the old tier barely visible if you knew to look for it, the margin notation still legible in Inez's translation on the paper tucked into the frame beside it. On winter evenings, when Samuel was old enough to ask about it, and Rosa was old enough to climb onto her father's knee and point at it, Reuben would tell them about a dying man in El Paso and a promise, and Inez would tell them about what was written in the margins, and they would explain together, in the way that two people who have built a life together explain things, that sometimes the most important things are not the big clear marks in the center of the map, but the small, precise writing at the edges. Waiting for someone who knows how to read them, Samuel grew up understanding this. Rosa grew up understanding it more fiercely. Both of them grew up in the house on the Vega property, with the cottonwoods their father had planted growing tall in the east light, and their mother's books on every available surface, and the sound of the canyon community visible in the distance on clear days, and the blue door of the schoolroom at the end of the unpaved street of Soledad, which was still open every morning for every child who walked 4 miles or 400 yards to reach it. Reuben Archer, who had ridden into Soledad because his horse had thrown a shoe and had intended to ride out the same day, rode out of it exactly once in the subsequent 40 years, and that was to accompany his daughter Rosa to Las Cruces when she was 20 years old and appeared before a different judge in a different case, arguing with the composed and relentless clarity of her mother and the absolute refusal to be intimidated of her father, on behalf of a community whose land was being threatened, because some things run forward through generations like water finding its level. He sat in the gallery and watched her and felt the same thing he had felt watching Inez in that same courthouse 20 years before, which was the specific, profound admiration of a person recognizing in another the best possible version of everything, and the gratitude that goes so deep it has no bottom. When it was over and Rosa had won, because the case was solid and the documentation was meticulous and she was her mother's daughter in all the ways that mattered most, she came to find him in the gallery, still in the serious dark coat she had chosen for the hearing, and he stood up and she saw his face. "You are not going to cry," she said, with the slight severity she had inherited. "I am not going to cry," he agreed. "Good," she said, and then she hugged him, which was one of those things that does not require any further words at all. That evening, back in Soledad, Reuben sat on the porch with Inez the way they had been sitting on the porch together for 2 decades, in the easy companionship of people who have built something that holds and know that it holds. And the canyon was visible to the north in the late light, and the cottonwoods were tall in the east, and the kitchen light was on inside, and it smelled of pinon smoke and coffee, and the particular quality of a life that has been lived as completely as anyone can reasonably ask. She was remarkable, he said. She was, Inez agreed. She was you, he said. Inez turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the same one he had first seen across a saloon table in the afternoon light when she had looked at the map and recognized it, the look of encountering something of value and understanding it fully. Only this time she was looking at him, and had been for 20 years, and it had not lost any of its precision. She was herself, Inez said. Which is more? He took her hand, the way he had taken it on the porch that autumn evening when she had told him about the child who was to be their son, carefully, and with a gentleness that never quite felt like his hands, and they sat together in the last of the light, and the cottonwoods moved in the evening wind, and the schoolroom door was locked for the night but would be open again in the morning, and the map on the kitchen wall was there as it had always been, its margins full of the small, precise writing that had mattered more than anyone knew until the right person read it, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to go on went on, and it was, in every way that counted, enough.